So we're going to focus just on causal determinism. And so we already saw in the first lecture that the determinism is often seen as a kind of threat to free will. So I want to say a bit more about causal determinism. So because causal determinism is a view about the deterministic laws of nature, it means that given a particular set, particular initial conditions and deterministic laws, then you're only ever going to get one result, one possible future. Or so there's only ever going to be one physically possible future. To say it's physically possible is just to say that it results from the deterministic laws and those initial conditions. We might be able to imagine different futures. It might be conceivable that a different thing happens. So we might still say that there's metaphysically or logically possible different futures. But in terms of what can actually happen, and given the initial conditions and deterministic laws, we have one effect. So consider a sort of diagram again. So from the first lecture, so we have the initial conditions at the start, and then we have the laws of nature. And so at the start of time, that will cause particular things. Those will cause another particular set of things, and another set of things, and another set of things, so on, and so on, so on, so on, until we get to the present. Now, given those initial conditions at the beginning of time and deterministic laws of nature, then we were only ever going to get the same things happen, because causes, each individual cause was going to necessitate its effect. And whilst this is a very simplistic diagram with just one cause and one effect, just imagine that with all the massive amount of causes and effects that you've had since the beginning of time. It couldn't have really been otherwise, because each individual cause was going to necessitate its effect, and so on and so forth. And an effect would become a cause, necessitate an effect, and so on. A way I like to think about this is that, right, with causal determinism, you take your initial setup and you take your rules of the game, and there's a single way things play out. So the rules of the game here are just the deterministic laws, how things work. They don't allow for any deviance from the rules. The rules just say, if you have this, then you're going to get this. And they have these kind of generalizations about what happens between particular types of things and other things. So given particular conditions, you're going to get particular effects. And it can never be anything otherwise. So now we've got an idea of what causal determinism is. It's the idea that if the laws of nature are deterministic, and given a particular set of initial conditions, we're only ever going to get a single possible future. Things can't really be otherwise. So libertarians, like we've seen, are usually incompatibilists. They hold that determinism rules out free will. But the important thing to think about with incompatibilists is that whilst they might also often be libertarians, they aren't always. So incompatibilism itself is just a view about the compatibility of free will and causal determinism. So the incompatibilist doesn't say that the laws of nature are deterministic. They make no claim about that. They just say, well, they just say that if causal determinism is true, if the laws of nature are deterministic, then there's no free will. It's important that this is a hypothetical, it's a conditional. Like, we're not saying, as an incompatibilist, you're not saying that you think determinism is true or that there's no free will. In fact, you're not really making a claim about what actually exists at all. It's all about a compatibility or lack of compatibility, more accurately, between two things. So libertarians, whilst a libertarian could allow that causal determinism is compatible with free will, libertarians themselves think that free will as we have it is indeterministic or involves undetermined actions. So they actually do hold that causal determinism is false and that there's free will. So they have quite a stronger view. If you were to compare the commitments, the theoretical commitments of incompatibilists versus libertarians, the incompatibilist is just going to say, well, I don't think causal determinism is compatible with free will. Whereas the libertarian has a lot more to prove. An incompatibilist can give arguments for incompatibilism and against compatibilism. But a libertarian has to do more. They have to show us that causal determinism is false and that we have free will, and that free will, as we have it, involves indeterminism. But unlike the incompatibilists, they don't need to commit to compatibilism being false. It just so happens that they mostly do, but they don't need to take on that commitment. Importantly, as we'll see in future lectures, not all incompatibilists are libertarians. Even if those are distinct views, and you can be an incompatibilist without being a libertarian, it could be that, as a matter of coincidence, most incompatibilists were libertarians. That might have been the case at one point, but nowadays, more and more incompatibilists are impossibilists, or what might be thought of more generally as free will skeptics. So in later lectures, we'll talk about hard determinists, impossibilists, hard incompatibilists, free will skeptics. These are all people that think for a variety of different reasons that we don't have free will. And all these people, well, the majority of them at least, the majority of skeptics are also incompatibilists. Not only do they think we don't have free will, they also think that free will is incompatible with the truth of causal determinism. So let's now consider two main forms of libertarianism. Now, the first form of libertarianism is what's often called leeway libertarianism. So we encountered the term leeway in the earlier lecture, the idea about, different things that we can do. So the leeway libertarian will focus more on the idea that we could have done otherwise. So the leeway libertarian thinks, well, it's all about alternative possibilities. I had the ability, the chance, or the power to do otherwise. Additionally, they think this makes best sense of the idea that what we did was up to us. So when we, take the left fork of the path rather than the right and say, I could have taken the right path, and because I could have taken the right path rather than the left path, what I did was up to me. Again, focus here is on alternative possibilities. Now, on the other hand, we have the sourcehood libertarian or source libertarian. And so for them, this kind of libertarian is much more focused on the idea that free will has its origin or source within us. So when we choose to go left rather than right, when we reach a fork in the road, it matters less, or it might still matter, but matters less to that libertarian that you could have gone right. What matters for them much more, or much more fundamentally, is that the decision to go left has its origin within you. It doesn't have some origin outside of you in the past or in some other person. So you often read terms like, well, the buck stops with me. So libertarians in the US like this phrase. I think it might come from poker or something like this. But the idea is that, if we're looking at who to blame and you perform some action, they'll say, well, the buck stops with me. I'm the one that caused it. I'm the one who did the mean thing. Blame me. I take responsibility. So, really focus on the idea that they caused it. Again, they're thinking here that being the ultimate source or origin of your actions explains why something was up to you. So the reason why you went left, or what makes you going left rather than right a freely willed action is that, that was up to you because that decision had its source in you in some sense. So we might wonder about the differences between leeway and source libertarianism. So I think that if you read more about libertarianism, some of the sort of commitments or exact views of certain authors might be a little bit confusing. I think Robert Kane is most clear about this. So he thinks that both that being the ultimate source of your action and having alternative possibilities is important. But for him, what's most important or most fundamental is being the ultimate source of your action, because he thinks that being the ultimate source of your action entails or implies that you have alternative possibilities. So if you were to explain why you were responsible, why you acted freely, you might mention that you had alternative possibilities, but it would ultimately come down to you being the ultimate source of your actions. So consider an example like this from earlier. Suppose we have Simon and he acted freely in stealing some apples. You might ask, well, why did he act freely? For the leeway libertarian, the explanation is just going to be something like, because he could have done otherwise. And that's a sufficient explanation. But for the sourcehood libertarian, we have to go a bit deeper The source libertarian thinks that actually the most fundamental or deeper explanation is that, well, he acted freely in stealing the apples because he's the ultimate source of his action. That happens to imply that he could have done otherwise, but if we don't get down to that deeper explanation, we're not getting a full account of why Simon acted freely. Right, so let's get cracking on more specific accounts of libertarianism. One brief note before beginning, though, is that we have this distinction between leeway and source libertarianism, and then this distinction between event causal and agent causal libertarianism. The source and leeway forms of libertarianism don't line up exactly with event and agent causal. So when you're thinking about the relevance of sourcehood or leeway, that's really just about the explanation of why we have free actions. When we think about the distinction between event causal and agent causal, it's more about the particular causes. It's not saying much about the actual whether free will is ultimately about alternative possibilities or being the ultimate source. It's much more about the causal relations. So the relations between causes and effects. It's important to bear those those things in mind, because you'll have people like Robert Kane, who's an event causal libertarian, but also source libertarian. And you'll have someone like Derek Perboom, who, when he defends libertarianism, he defends a form of agent causal libertarianism, but he's a source libertarian. And then you'll have others, that Roderick Chisholm, who's an agent causal libertarian, but is also really a leeway libertarian. And so these things don't map on together. So it's important to bear these in mind. So we're going to focus now on event causal libertarianism, and then we'll turn to agent causal libertarianism. So like I said, event causal libertarianism is really a view about a form of libertarianism that agrees that with most people that causation is purely in terms of events. So the entire world, a ball hits another ball, a person talks to you, so you respond. These all involve events causing other events. And for the libertarian, they think that freely willed actions are no different. So actions for the event causal libertarian are just caused by mental events. What are mental events? These will be ones involving mental states or psychological states, such as beliefs, desires, and intentions. And moreover, these mental events will be the reasons we act. So here's an example. You decide to pick up the cup. So I take a cup, take a sip. For the libertarian, what's happening there is that there are certain beliefs and desires that I possess, that I have in my mind, and these things then cause me to pick up the cup. And those are also the reason why. So I believed there's a cup there, I had a desire to take a sip, also had a desire to give an example for the lecture of event causation. And so these events involving my mental states resulted in me picking this up and having a sip. And so these are all events involving mental states that belong to me. And for the libertarian, freely willed actions happen on this model. So any particular action is going to involve, any particular explanation of a freely willed action is going to involve discussion of the person's mental states as being the cause or the reason the person acted as they did. So if someone steals, you'll say that they stole because they wanted to steal. And that will be the cause of that effect. The cause being, or among a relevant feature amongst the causes, is that the person wanted to steal, and the effect was that they did steal. So let's now consider how the event causal libertarian would respond to the basic argument. So remember the sort of core point of the basic argument is that there's no clear place where true responsibility enters the picture. And this is because no action that we perform ever seems free enough to really make us truly responsible for what we did. So the event causal libertarian says, well, okay, you want a place where responsibility enters the picture, here it is. You need the right kind of indeterministic event. And so for the event causal libertarian, you have a particular kind of event which is indeterministic. So that event is not necessarily going to cause some effect, but could have caused some other effect or caused some other event. And if you have one of those of the right kind, then you're able to have freely willed action, and you can get true responsibility entering the picture. So Robert Kane has the most well fleshed out form of event causal libertarianism, and he thinks that certain indeterministic events are kind of neuronal, or this inner neurons, certain kinds of indeterminism in the right places in the brain can lead to certain forms of decisions, certain decisions which are torn between two major things. And when we have one of these kind of sort of torn decisions, the result is what he calls a self-forming action. So for example, you have your major life choices. So the choice about whether to go to Glasgow University or Edinburgh University, or you have a dilemma between choosing a moral value or self-interest. So you might see somebody being mugged, but you might be on your way to an important interview, and you might think, my morals tell me I should go and help this person, or at least phone the police, stop them getting mugged. But it would be in my best interest to get to this interview, because then I could get this job and I'll be rich because it's a really good job, let's suppose. And so when we have these kind of like torn decisions, either major life choices or a dilemma between moral values and self-interest, Keynes suggests that, you get this kind of indeterminism in the right parts of your brain. Because it's in the right parts of your brain, you'll get this, whether you choose to go to Glasgow University or Edinburgh University, or to choose your moral values or self-interest, isn't determined. It isn't sort of set in stone before you make that decision what's going to happen. And because it's not set in stone, it's undetermined, the result helps to sort of bring free will, bring responsibility into the picture. And moreover, Keynes thinks that you really craft or develop yourself through these kinds of actions. So if we look at these alleged self-forming actions, could we say that this is self-creation? Is this where self-creation is happening? And if so, do we then get free will? If so, this really will respond directly to the challenge that the basic argument presents. So the basic argument is asking, where does true responsibility enter the picture? And the event causal libertarian is saying, really, you just needed to find the right kind of indeterministic event.